Here we are. Welcome, everybody. This is the 35th annual Davis, Markert, and Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. Very glad to have you all here. My name's Derek Peterson. I'm the Faculty Senate Chair, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here, among others, the children of Chandler Davis, who will be meeting shortly, are with us in the audience. A real pleasure to have them here. I'll also be shortly introducing our distinguished speaker, about whom more in a few minutes. This lecture honors three colleagues, Dr. Chandler Davis, Clement Markert, and Mark Nickerson, who were drummed out of university service in 1954. They had refused to give testimony to the U.S. House Committee on Un-American Activities, which was then investigating communism on American university campuses. President Hatcher's report into this unhappy affair is on the Faculty Senate's website, and it makes for interesting reading if you're into this sort of thing. He proclaimed, that is, President Hatcher proclaimed, that the university would, as he said, not knowingly employ communists on its staff, and assured the House Committee investigating the matter that we fully share the interests of our citizens in guarding, preserving, and enhancing our American heritage. Doctors Davis, Markert, and Nickerson were sacrificed at the altar of political expediency and dismissed from their posts. In the wake of these events, the American Association of University Professors sanctioned the University of Michigan for its bad faith toward its faculty. In 1958, the university put in place Regents Bylaw 5.09, which laid out the procedures by which tenured members of the faculty can be dismissed from university service. Today, Regents Bylaw 509 and its protections are the very peg on which our tenure here at the University of Michigan hangs. What would Chandler Davis make of the University of Michigan today? We're confronting a new form of McCarthyism in our own time, as over the past 2 years, a new generation of demagogues in Congress have opened up investigations into what they call anti-Semitism on campuses. Yesterday, the AAUP and the American Federation of Teachers issued an excellent report describing the weaponizing of Title VI in U.S. higher education. The report shows that across American academia, investigations into anti-Semitism have ballooned to an all-time high. Pro-Israel and right-wing advocacy groups have driven this surge of anti-Semitism investigations. At least 78% of the investigations analyzed in the AFT AAUP report were launched in response to complaints made by one or the other of such organized groups. Here at Michigan, our administration has shown a commendable willingness to stand up to some forms of conservative demagoguery. So earlier this year, 2 members of the faculty here at U of M published uncomplimentary comments about the murdered activist Charlie Kirk. There was a firestorm of outrage in conservative media. Thankfully, President Grasso and the UM regents stood firm against calls in conservative media for the dismissal of our colleagues from the faculty. For that, we in faculty government, and I'm sure all of us in the faculty, are very grateful. About pro-Palestinian activism, though, the administration has shown itself willing to bend to some of the demands that the demagogues who are manipulating Title VI have made. As chair of the Faculty Senate, I've repeatedly expressed our collective unhappiness about the ill-considered and hasty modifications which were made last year to the Statement of Student Rights and Responsibilities, which put in place a putative process to police and control student activism. And I've expressed my conviction that the ongoing and prosecution, that is, of pro-Palestinian students, 11 of them in fact, under the revised SSRR is an embarrassment and a discredit to our institution. Yes, the student activists did transgress against some of the rules that the university uses to limit and constrain activist behavior, but their infractions pale by comparison with the magnitude of the human injustice that's been done by Israel and Gaza. They are on the right side of history, and I hope that in some future time we will have a lecture series named after them. For those of you inspired by the example that Chandler Davis set and concerned about present-day attacks on higher education and attacks also on activism, I'd like to highlight a new book that we're going to be launching shortly. It's titled In the Spirit of H. Chandler Davis, Activism and the Struggle for Academic Freedom. I just bought my copy on the way in, and I encourage all of you to do the same. It's a lovely book, a collection of essays by Davis and other scholars arguing against censorship, anti-protest policies, institutional neutrality, and other enemies of free speech. We will be launching this new book shortly. In 1990, the Senate Assembly chose to honor these heroes of the struggle for academic freedom by establishing the Davis, Markert, and Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. This year, members of the committee put their heads together to identify a 2025 speaker that will illuminate our present condition, and I particularly thank Craig Smith of the University Library and Nick Tobier of the Stamp School of Art and Design, who are the co-chairs of this year's DMN committee. They've done hard work to make this event happen, so thank you to both of them. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Lori McCauley, who's Provost and Academic Vice President for Academic Affairs here at the U of M. Dr. McCauley has spent the whole of her scholarly career at Michigan. She was hired as an assistant professor of dentistry in 1992 and rose through the ranks to become the department chair of periodontics and oral medicine, and then dean of the School of Dentistry. She was made a provost in 2022. As provost, she's worked to improve undergraduate education, to promote environmental sustainability, and ensure that all members of the faculty are fairly compensated without regard to gender. In my short time as chair of the Senate, I found her to be an engaging and thoughtful leader, responsive to the interests of the faculty, willing to work with us in faculty government to get good things done. So it's my pleasure to welcome Provost McCauley to the lectern.
Thank you, Professor Peterson, and welcome to everyone here. It's really wonderful to be here with you on the 35th annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture. They always prove to be thought-provoking and engaging, and I'm sure today will be as well. I want to start by thanking SACUA for supporting this, as well as the DMN Lecture Committee, all of our sponsors and collaborators, and in particular the Democracy and Civic Empowerment Initiative for supporting and making this event possible. Their dedication ensures that this annual gathering continues to highlight one of the University of Michigan's most vital commitments, the freedom to teach, to question, and to think without fear. As Professor Peterson noted, this lecture honors three members of our faculty from the 1950s, H. Chandler Davis, Clement Markert, and Mark Nickerson. 7 decades later, the lessons we must learn from their ordeal remain timely. Their story remains a powerful reminder that academic freedom is never automatic. It must be renewed by each generation that values it. Each year, this lecture calls us to think about what that renewal means in the current time. How we protect open inquiry, how we model intellectual courage for our students, and how we sustain an environment where ideas can be explored freely and respectfully. This year's theme, Intellectual Freedom in an Authoritarian Age, asks us to consider how these principles hold up when the world around us grows more polarized and less tolerant of dissent. Our keynote speaker, Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, will help us explore these questions. Her scholarship on authoritarianism, propaganda, and democratic resilience offers a framework for understanding both the threats we face and the responsibilities that we share. Before we turn to the lecture, I want to recognize the colleague who has opened our program and who will moderate the panel that follows the lecture. It's my honor to welcome back to the podium Professor Derek Peterson, who serves as the Ali Mazrui, Collegiate Professor of History and African Studies here at the University of Michigan. He's a MacArthur Fellow and one of our most notable public historians. His most recent book, A Popular History of Idi Amin's Uganda. Professor Peterson exemplifies the spirit of this event, rigorous in thought, courageous in inquiry, and deeply committed to the ethical responsibilities of scholarship. Please join me in welcoming back Professor Derek Peterson, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Provost Macaulay. So our speaker for today is Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who's professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. She writes about fascism, authoritarianism, propaganda, and democracy protection. She's a recipient of Guggenheim, NEH, Fulbright, and other fellowships, and an advisor to Protect Democracy. At a time when many of us are keeping our heads down out of a sense of caution, Dr. Ben-Ghiat is an active and visible presence in public life, bringing her expertise and knowledge to bear on our current predicaments. She appears frequently on CNN and MSNBC, PBS, and other networks, and her Substack, titled Lucid, has over 200,000 subscribers. Her latest book is a New York Times bestseller. It's titled Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present. It examines how illiberal leaders use corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power, and how resistance to them has unfolded over the course of a century. She's also a consultant for businesses, civil society organizations, and television. She advised, among others, Guillermo del Toro's Academy Award-winning 2022 film Pinocchio and the 2024 Netflix series Hitler and the Nazis, Evil on Trial. This afternoon, she's talking to us about the title Intellectual Freedom in an Authoritarian Age. Dr. Ben-Ghiat.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Faculty Senate Chair Peterson, Provost Macaulay, Professor McCarthy, the lecture committee, and the distinguished faculty panel with whom I will discuss this presentation. And I'm so honored to be delivering this year's Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture. And certainly this year it feels very precious to have this lecture. I'm very grateful that this lecture exists at a public university in particular. Right now, an authoritarian state is taking shape in the United States at a pace normally seen after a coup. We have military in the streets of American cities, people rounded up by masked members of state security forces, as they're known in other countries, and disappeared into domestic and foreign prisons. Government agencies and the Republican Party have become personal tools of a leader who seems intent on consolidating power at home, engaging in a kind of domestic forever war against civilians, and promoting the interests of his foreign autocrat allies. And this same president is engaging in shakedowns of businesses, media outlets, and universities to create a climate of subordination, generate income, and transform society quickly by standardizing government talking points throughout society and silencing threatening information. And that's going to be a theme, this mix of noise and silence and standardization, which the Nazis called coordination or synchronization, as did the Italian fascists. That I am not here or there with you personally today is one small outcome or data point of this larger process. I would like to remain in the United States as an on-site witness and chronicler of developments I have studied for decades. My priority is to continue my efforts at civic education, even in an atmosphere of threats to physical safety, which I've lived with on and off now for a decade, as have others who saw what was coming in the United States and spoke out on behalf of democracy. So here I am on Zoom, imparting whatever wisdom I can give about what authoritarians do to intellectual and academic freedom, why they do it, and the role of educational institutions in peaceful resistance efforts. So let me start my, let me share my screen. Okay, where did this go? All right, let me move this. There we go. Move this up. Sorry, excuse me. Slideshow. Sorry for this. Okay. I'm trying to get this to be, I've done this a million times and it's not play from start. There we go. All right, here we are. Okay. There, I think we can do this. Can you all see this, the Bancroft? I hope you can. Someone will tell me if not. So I'd like to start with this incident from October 2024, which previews many of the themes of the lecture. Authoritarians have always gone after education systems, and educators and military academies are included in this as they seek to change the political culture, indoctrinate new generations with their own worldview, and eradicate critical thinking. As I wrote in, why won't this go? There we go. As I wrote in my book, Strongmen, propaganda may seem to be all about noise, but silence and absence are equally important to its operation. Strongmen disappear people, and they also disappear knowledge that conflicts with their ideologies and goals. Far from being ivory towers closed off from society, educational institutions are often frontline targets of those who seek to destroy democracy. What happens on campus reflects and often anticipates, and this is a point, transformations of society in an authoritarian direction. And so it was at Annapolis. In the spring of 2024, the U.S. Naval Academy contacted me about giving the Bancroft Lecture in the fall. So it was a big honor. The History Department of the Naval Academy sponsors the lecture, and my approved topic was, here's the flyer, militaries and authoritarian regimes, coups, corruption, and the costs of losing democracy. So as you see from the poster, I was going to focus on Chile, where a military known for its democratic culture and loyalty to the Constitution became an instrument of state terror and stayed that way for 17 years. And I was also going to talk about the costs of corruption and incompetence on militaries, using the examples of Mussolini's Italy in World War II and the early months of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So they're kind of, or at least Putin is there too. The Bancroft Lecture is a nonpartisan event, and I was not going to cover American leaders and domestic politics. But Republicans apparently decided that a lecture by me on this topic, so close to the election, simply could not happen. And I should specify that I was known to MAGA. My op-ed on the small lies that prepared the ground for the big lie in CNN had been featured in Trump's lawsuit against CNN in 2022, the same year I gave interviews to the January 6th committee. I'd also been part of amicus briefs, including one that went to the Supreme Court in 2024, and many TV appearances had earned me mentions on Steve Bannon's War Room, etc. So a coordinated campaign was cooked up that involved the Heritage Foundation, the Daily Signal, Washington Times, and GOP members of Congress. And the degree of coordination was very interesting to me as a historian of propaganda. And the point was to pressure the Naval Academy to cancel the lecture. So this is something that was on Congressman Keith Self's website. So when I received the perhaps inevitable call from the leadership of the Naval Academy that the lecture would be postponed, which was their way of it was canceled, they mentioned the threat of Hatch Act prosecution. Now, the Hatch Act restricts government employees from engaging in openly political activities. And I was in an airport at the time, and I just remember thinking, what does the Hatch Act have to do with any of this or with me? A week later, The argument was spelled out in a congressional letter signed by 17 Republicans, including Mike Waltz, Clay Higgins, Ronnie Jackson, and others. The letter depicted me as a partisan historian for my past criticisms of Trump and singled out my what they called a fake claim, a false claim, that he had an authoritarian character. And thus my physical presence at the Academy would politicize, that was their word, the Bancroft Lecture, and thus it would be a violation of the Hatch Act, even if I didn't talk about Trump or US politics during my talk. So I was unacceptable as a person, regardless of what I might say at Annapolis. And as someone who has long studied how authoritarians target people as well as institutions, I found this very interesting, that your person becomes kind of toxic regardless of what you say. I also found interesting the amount of effort expended on this just weeks before a very, very important election. So this episode reminds us that attacks on intellectual freedom are never just about ideas. They're about, and play here were two favorite autocratic games. One is bullying and making an example, where one person is punished or one institution is punished to dissuade others. Now, MAGA likely already knew what plans they had for the military if Trump got elected, and punishing the Naval Academy was a message they were sending to West Point and other academies and to the military as a whole. And one law of authoritarian bullying is that when you cave to the bully, he always comes back for more. And in fact, the leadership of the Naval Academy, along with top military officials, judge advocates general, have since been purged. And the military academies have seen their curriculums altered in line with the aims of suppressing diversity, social justice, the history of these things, and other democratic values. So this brings me to what I call moral collapse, which we are living through in America and is essential to the success of authoritarianism wherever it descends. Moral collapse. Freeing people from the idea that they should tell the truth, attend to facts, and respect others as individuals with dignity and autonomy is part of the agenda. You have to get rid of this if you're going to have an authoritarian state that lasts. When nothing is true, everything is possible, to quote the book by Peter Pomerantsev. The terrifying thing about authoritarianism is that hollowing out government institutions, we hear a lot about the hollowing out process, where institutions become tools of the leader or the party. This is just the start. Autocracies also hollow out people. It's very, very tragic. So that they abandon their conscience and their belief in their own critical faculties. And they become, in their actions, they reinforce the state's suppression of solidarity and the rule of law. And ultimately, authoritarianism requires you not only to betray others, but really also to betray yourself. And Hannah Arendt would have understood the tragic takeaway of a woman who lived through decades of communism in Albania. Don't trust yourself, don't trust your own skin, don't trust your own husband or wife. So for authoritarianism to be durable as a system, even beyond the person currently in office, you have to have this shift in morals and values, which ultimately can lead to a kind of nihilism, a cynicism, an emptying out, including the value of upholding the truth. You also have to, and it's part of it, emotionally recondition people, and this in communist systems is called re-education, to create a climate conducive to people accepting lying, corruption, and violence as normal. And this is why in the Joe Biden years, Republican states started claiming that students who read about institutionalized racism and slavery would have emotional distress, and that was a bad thing. And of course, what they were doing was taking away readings that might spark the conscience, be reminders of keep alive the flame of recognizing injustice and wanting to do something about it in the world. All of that is dangerous for authoritarian stability. So the histories had to go, the readings had to go, the books had to go. And that's the silencing part, that's part of it. Now we're also seeing more noise, a very aggressive modeling by individuals of extremist values, a breaking of taboos. And right now, the United States government is really a kind of laboratory for freedom from every kind of ethical and professional norm that might restrain behaviors of individuals, political entities, and corporations, this kind of deregulation. It is why the Secretary of War, Hegseth, is telling the military they are untied from the old rules of engagement. It is why Stephen Miller is telling law enforcement that they are unleashed, and why the government is wrecking all compliance, oversight checks, accountability, and all of this. It's kind of moral deregulation that is parallel to the end of controls on polluting, and all of that. The rehabilitation, I'm just picking out this as a kind of limit case. The rehabilitation of Hitler is part of this, and Vice President Vance and Elon Musk have been working to drop the taboo on Nazi speech, and both of them have spoken in Germany on this subject. So this is happening in the States, but it's obviously connected to a whole transnational global far-right effort. Why should there be a firewall against that speech, they say. And when Vance spoke about this in Germany, he was simply, in a way, echoing what the Nazis were doing a century ago. And this is in my book, Strongmen, when Adolf Hitler had speaking bans placed on him for his hate speech in the 1920s from different German states. The Nazi Party made various posters. This is one of them. He's the only man who's not allowed to speak, presenting him as someone who now would be referred to as having been canceled, complete with the tape over his mouth. And then Musk shows up in Germany to speak to the Alternative for Germany far-right conference, and that's a party that has neo-Nazis in it, saying to them, why should you feel guilty anymore about Hitler? That's old stuff. You don't need to feel guilty about Hitler anymore. And so this is why we're seeing this normalization of extremism in language and bodily things, the breaking of the taboos, Nick Fuentes becoming more prominent. That's why we're seeing all kinds of salutes around in 2025. Here's one by Musk. Here's one by Bannon. And here is most recent, sorry, this should be 2025, not 2024. And he is dressing in a certain way. Anyway, you see what he's doing. And of course, this is not new. Autocrats routinely rehabilitate the most lawless people from their national histories. And Xi Jinping in China has chosen, of all people, to rehabilitate Mao, the mass destroyer of China. Now, in the US, this means that our regional authoritarian state in our past, the Jim Crow South, must also be acceptable. And of course, this has been going on for a very long time. This is not new, but this is now the part of the culture of the party. And so you may have seen this before. This is just from Politico news article. And so you have all of these vectors of extremism represented in this group chat here on Telegram. Okay, so get rid of that. Now we can consider how this applies to intellectual freedom. One reason for sure, that authoritarians go after intellectuals, the press, and academic freedom is that they think big, they think long term, And they know that you need a shift in the political culture in civil society to support the new values you wish to inculcate. So propaganda is not just about getting people to believe this or that lie, or even a big lie. It's about changing the way people think and feel and the way they view the world, and getting them to hear certain words and have certain social associations. So it's also an emotional reconditioning, as I referred to before. So demonizing and delegitimizing, we're living through a massive effort at delegitimizing. Anybody who works with fact-based research protocols, evidence, so prosecutors, lawyers, research scientists, academics, and teachers, librarians, on and on and on, and democratic models of pedagogy have to go and be replaced with fanaticism, ideology, facts, or as Kellyanne Conway said years ago, alternative facts, facts and reality that comes from those facts that serve those in power. So researchers, scientists, journalists, academics in any field become threats just from following this fact-based protocol. And that's where, as you all know, conspiracy theories proliferate. And in such a system, you express loyalty to the regime or to the state by acquiescing to false versions of reality. And you are asked to perform those lies in public. And you saw how after 2020 election, performing election denial became a way of keeping your status within the party, like the party line. But the lies must be maintained, and your status is maintained by your skill at repeating the lies. And it's one reason that this administration now has over 30 people in high positions who were on-air talent at Fox News. They are very good at this skill. So performing those lies in public, including in the classroom, right, is key. Whether it's the big lies of 2020 election, Jews controlling the world, or whatever. The content of the lie differs, but the mandate of performing it in public, including in classrooms, faculty meetings, I'm just taking the academic context, is key. So obviously, universities are prime hunting grounds for autocrats because they train the next generations of leaders, and elite formation is very important to autocrats. And this is why they don't just change the curriculum, they change university structures, they change personnel, large-scale policy changes. So they don't only change the content of learning to reinforce their ideological agenda, but they seek to remake the purpose of education. And that's an important point. They remake also higher education as a different kind of space. Instead of a space of critical thinking, curiosity, even solidarity, where you respect each other in conversation and discussions, the higher education institution must become a place to perpetuate and fill people with authoritarian values. So it must reward intolerance, conformism. You have informers there, so it's a place of suspicion and hostility and uncertainty. You don't know who is the informer. And so the purpose of education, the space of education, as well as the content of education, change in an autocratic system. That's important. So this is just an example from fascist Italy, where first they pressured professors and students by bureaucratic means, because there you had almost all public universities. You had a loyalty oath, and then the next year you had a requirement to join the fascist party, and then you had to wear the black shirt sometimes. And so they went gradually but slowly. They had a lot of student informers. I've worked with those archives. And they had fascist university groups. And this is one of them. And this is, I like this, it's during the war. And it seems like a regular fascist group. And at the very back, there's a squadrous dagger. And this goes all the way back to the original violence of the regime. Sorry, before it was a regime, of the movement. So the violence is always there, even though you have a smiling group. And I think that's the end of I'm going to stop sharing. And it's not the end of my lecture quite yet, but it's the end of my PowerPoint. So in the Cold War era, a very important and far-reaching revision of educational system was under Chile, in Chile under Pinochet, who seized power in a US-backed coup and targeted universities for cleansing, this kind of cultural cleansing. And tens of thousands of staff, students, and teachers were dismissed. Thousands were sent to prison. Philosophy and social science departments were closed because they were supposed to be incubators of Marxism. But you also had, in line with the neoliberal economics that was Chile was a laboratory of, you had privatizations. You had defunding public universities and starting new private universities, including ones funded by Opus Dei, which had an important role in economic policy in Chile. You also had the junta replacing civilian rectors with military officials. You had to create, as I said before, the university as a place of uncertainty and suspicion. You had the institution of faculty prosecutors who would handle, you were encouraged to denounce each other, and a faculty member was a prosecutor. And so that's also an interesting twist. And if you were found guilty, you were sent to prison and tortured. And this combination of creating suspicion and hostility and privatization and defunding has come into the 21st century and inspired many areas, many authoritarian states. Today, Orban is using this menu. In Hungary, he has subtracted 16% from the educational budget over the last decade. Of course, he initially started out repressing pedagogy to do with LGBTQ populations, banning gender studies, and yet the most recent thing he's done is a vengeance law, as it's called by the opposition, which punishes teachers, staff, and students who participate in protest. And this is classic because the more they feel vulnerable, the autocrat, the more they penalize. They don't just stop with, they become more creative in the way they try and get people not to protest in the first place. Let's put it that way. So the most important thing about this vengeance law is that educational policy is now under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Interior, which is in charge of law enforcement. That's a big move. And in theory, this allows the state to monitor teachers' laptops and videotape their classrooms. So you have this kind of upping, as he feels more vulnerable, and there's more protests because of defunding, privatization, firings of teachers, you have more repression. Okay, just quickly, I want to consider, and this is a good segue to moving to our conclusion, the role of protest in autocracies that comes from educational institutions. And really, when you look at resistance movements, young people and students, whether it's high schools or colleges, have been very, very important. And they're often the first people to start protesting. So autocrats know very well that universities can be incubators of protest. And we've already seen in our country, even during the Biden years, how important student walkouts and protests have been against book bans and censorship. I just want to mention for context that it's not getting much media attention, but we are living through a global renaissance of nonviolent protest. It's absolutely incredible. There are record numbers of young people engaging in and out of universities in protests. Since 2019, Chile, Belarus, the United States, Iran, China, Israel, Tunisia, on and on and on, Poland, have experienced either their biggest demonstrations in decades or ever. And each protest is unique, and there are national and local causes, but there's a kind of collectively a desire for governance informed by ideals of social justice, respect. And in dictatorships, there's also, I think, a growing, this new generation, a growing sense that they want more freedom, more autonomy, more respect that cannot be satisfied within existing systems of rule. And I think it's very significant that in 2022 in China, an experience of collective dehumanization, the lockdown protests, lockdowns from COVID, sparked the biggest protests since Tiananmen Square. And 79 universities across China had demonstrations. They had some form of protest. And I think this is very significant. And it caught the Chinese regime totally by surprise. And really, regimes like this, they have no response other than more surveillance and more repression for the demands of young people to be treated with dignity. So that is a story to follow. So coming back to our own situation as a conclusion, in February, so it was like less than a month after this, this administration started, I wrote an essay for my Substack, and I entitled it, "Out of the Chaos and Corruption, a Revelation and a Reckoning Will Come." And I wrote that the corruption and entitlement and vendetta mentality would be so extreme that people's eyes would be opened. And more people would come to see that the end goal was allowing the very few to profit at the expense of the many. And we're seeing that reckoning start with the numbers building at No King's protests, other events, the very important spontaneous appearances of people who are ordinary people, some in their pajamas, who run out to help people being targeted by ICE. The record turnouts of voters for the elections we just had. And the presence of young people and students, the importance in shifting our consciousness of genocide, international law, plunder of the environment and the labor force, and the cost of lies, the cost of suppressing the truth. And I am the last person to underestimate the gravity of what we face. And I know that each victory can spark a cycle of repression. But one of my maxims is never underestimate the American people. And I truly believe that the United States has the potential to defeat this nascent autocracy and come out of it with a stronger, more just, and more democratic democracy and system. And for that, we have to counter moral collapse with a work of moral renewal that starts from the ground up, from the person up. And education is key to that. Civic education, education within campuses, among campuses. And as educators, we can model the values we want to see in the world, both for our students and for the public through civic communications that counter disinformation, establish bonds of solidarity, and we all have something to contribute in that regard. So I thank you so much for having this lecture, which is an example for turning knowledge and the lessons of history to public good today, and protecting democracy and intellectual freedom in an authoritarian age. I'm very honored to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that lecture. To follow up on the lecture and to expand on some of its themes, we've invited three distinguished colleagues to offer a response and to relate what we've just heard from Dr. Ben-Ghiat to their own fields of work. The three members of the panel should now proceed to the front while I briefly introduce them. They are Dr. Karima Banoun, who is the Lewis Symes Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School. She's served as a UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights and as an expert witness for the International Criminal Court and as a legal advisor to Amnesty International. She's the author of consequential work on gender and apartheid in Afghanistan and on Muslim fundamentalism. Our second respondent will be Jin Hong, who's the Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies and Associate Professor of Political Science here in our College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. Her research focuses on the political economy of authoritarianism, especially in East Asia. And the third respondent will be my colleague and co-traveler, Professor Ron Sooney, who's the William Sewell Distinguished University Professor Emeritus in History in the College of LS&A. He's a trailblazing historian and teacher of Russian, Armenian, and Georgian history and political science, the founder of the Center of Armenian Studies here at the U of M, and the author most recently of Red Flag Wounded, Stalinism and the Fate of the Soviet Experiment. They're going to go in the order that I've announced them. Each of them has been asked to speak for 5 to 10 minutes and no more. Time is in short supply and will be carefully doled out by the very stern members of the Faculty Senate office who will help us keep time. So let's start with Dr. Banoun.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to take part in this event, honoring the legacy of Professors Davis, Markert, and Nickerson, and to have the opportunity to comment on a truly erudite and timely lecture by Professor Ben-Ghiat. And I really want to thank the organizers for including me. We've been asked, as you heard, to speak for 5 to 10 minutes on these topics, which is just enough time to get yourself into trouble. But I will do my best. I wanted to start by saying how grave it is indeed that our speaker cannot be with us in the room, and how much we look forward to a day when we can welcome her here. And what I'd like to do quickly is to consider the issue of academic and intellectual freedom raised in her lecture under international human rights law, which is what I teach. We don't often enough conceive of things that happen in the United States as human rights questions, and we should. And then if I have time, I'm going to conclude with a couple of observations based on my own research on opponents of extremism in other countries, including Algeria, my father Mahfoud Banoun's home country. I think it's a critical moment for us to continue to try to work and think globally despite the obstacles. Let me start by saying that universities are inestimable spaces, the value of which to any truly democratic society cannot be overstated. And it was Mahfoud Banoun, who grew up in a peasant village under colonial rule and who ultimately went on to obtain his PhD here at the U of M, who would admonish me in my youth about the importance of universities and the fact that I should never take them for granted. It annoyed me at age 19, but he was absolutely right. The organization Scholars at Risk has noted that the institutions of higher education are, quote, engines of knowledge production, discovery, innovation, skills development, cultural preservation, and national progress. They model democratic discourse and international cooperation, as well as the search for self-realization and moral truth. This is, of course, why extremists in power are targeting universities. So let us remember that what happens here matters, and we should all take seriously our obligation to ensure that this great institution and others can fulfill these essential roles that Scholars at Risk outlined, that we can indeed be a bulwark against the moral collapse that Professor Ben-Ghiat talked about. Now, as a professor of international human rights law, it's perhaps entirely unsurprising that, in my view, one of the most important jobs of U.S. universities today is to respect and to defend human rights within our institutions, in our society, and in the world around us, both through the rigorous intellectual and scientific work that is done here, but also in the way that we operate. And what happened to Professors Davis, Markert, and Nickerson is an example of a stark failure to fulfill this mission in the past that underscores the imperative to do better today. How are U.S. universities doing in fulfilling these roles? Today, I would say the record is very mixed, and I don't have time to review it. There certainly have been negative developments that were alluded to in the introduction, and I note that no less than 9 UN human rights experts strongly criticized in 2024 the way in which U.S. universities were treating protesters protesting against Israeli atrocities in the Middle East. So that's on the negative side, the way those protesters were treated. In fact, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education came to the United States in May 2024, and looking at the treatment of student protesters, said that all the measures taken against them have inevitably created a chilling effect on the whole academic community and a climate of intimidation. And I think that must be part of why we have not yet seen mass student mobilization against the policies of the Trump administration. However, there have also been recent moments of profound courage in academia, and this echoes the optimistic note that Professor Ben-Ghiat ended with, including the rejection of the Trump administration's so-called Compact for Higher Education by a number of leading universities. That decision is absolutely crucial and has to be replicated in this moment because the most pressing need in the field of academic freedom is to defend the centrality of university autonomy and the principle that decisions about matters such as admissions and curricula have to be made on academic, not on political grounds. So this is part of a bigger problem, what we're experiencing now in academia. The former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Freedom of Expression, who is the US law professor David Kaye, wrote in 2020 in a report on academic freedom that globally, academics and their institutions were facing social harassment and state repression, as he called it. And he issued a stark warning then, concluding that, quote, attacks on academic freedom corrode the pillars of democratic life, of scientific progress, and of human development. And I think that is a warning we have to take very seriously. There are very stark consequences indeed for violations in these areas that we're talking about. I also wanted to remind us that the United States and other countries, in fact, have international legal obligations to respect academic freedom. And that may sound quite quaint in an environment where we're seeing an all-out assault on the rule of law. But I do believe that the rule of law continues to be a value we have to defend, and it's absolutely central to guaranteeing academic and intellectual freedoms. We have to rebuild something that we can no longer take for granted. As Professor Chetan Bhatt has explained, that's a centrist consensus on human rights, and it is critically important that we work together, perhaps from different political perspectives, but with a commitment to certain values and institutions in this moment. I also think we have to be humble and we have to learn from the world around us. And there is so much to be learned from those in other countries who have stood up to authoritarianism and extremism in various forms. And I keep thinking it's the moment to flip the script and have capacity building workshops for Americans run by people from countries like Afghanistan, Iran, and Hungary to help us understand the strategies that we need to develop now, because strategic thinking and action are vital. I wrote a book over a decade ago about frontline opponents of extremism, interviewing more than 300 people from more than 30 countries. And I learned from them many of the things that Professor Ben-Ghiat stressed here today. The importance of vocal opposition, the importance of speaking out and using any power or platform that you have to defy extremism, and the need to do this as fast as possible before it metastasizes beyond the possibility of treatment. My interest in this topic grew out of Algeria's own dark decade of the 1990s, when fundamentalist groups waged war against the civilian population in an effort to take power, and of course they began by targeting intellectuals. My own father, who loved universities, was ultimately driven out of teaching at the University of Algiers, which he loved, due to death threats. But he and so many of his colleagues refused to be silent even then and continued to publish inside the country and warn against extremism. I learned from the research that the more people and institutions who speak out, like my father and his colleagues, the safer those who speak out will be. and that actually, even when you think it might be useless, speaking out is a powerful method of empowering and emboldening other people. There is much to be gleaned from the words of the outspoken Algerian intellectuals of that time, though their context was totally different than ours. And one of modern Algeria's greatest writers, Tahir Djaout, was actually tragically assassinated in that period in 1993. And I encourage everyone to read his last book, which was published posthumously. It's called The Last Summer of Reason, and it is Algeria's 1984. He describes the rise of extremism in chilling detail, some of which will look really familiar to us now. And he projected what his country would look like if the fundamentalists took over. Minds would be closed, families destroyed, and on and on. But the real story of the novel is none of that. The real story of that novel is that some refused to submit. To use Professor Ben-Ghiat's words, they refused to be hollowed out. And the novel's hero, a man named Boualem Yeker, whose family name means stood up or awoke in the Tamazight language, is a free-thinking bookseller. I think it's no accident he was a bookseller. As Djaout described Yeker, he was one of those who had decided to resist, those who had become aware that when the hordes confronting them had managed to spread their fear and impose silence, they would have won. This is the silence Professor Ben-Ghiat was talking about. Like Professors Davis, Markert, and Nickerson, we need to find the determination to defy, to be like Boualem Yeker, to stand up and to ensure that those seeking to spread fear and impose silence do not win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benoon. On to you.
Thank you. I would also emphasize how much honor this is to be able to speak in front of my great colleagues and with Professor Ben-Ghiat. I also graduated from NYU, so I'm very glad my professor from my alma mater is speaking for us today. So I'm here to share, not just as a political scientist, but to share a personal story as a person who experienced different authoritarianism, especially in East Asia. I was born and grew up in South Korea, and when I was very young, not revealing too much personal information here, when I was very young, it was a military dictatorship, and I grew up in the period of democratization of the country. As a scholar, I study authoritarianism in East Asia, mainly China, North Korea, but also the past of South Korea and Taiwan. And before joining University of Michigan in 2022, I worked in Hong Kong for 8 years, where there was a massive but failed pro-democracy movement happen. So dictators in the 20th century often use mass violence, repression, and ideology to suppress dissent, but that tactics have become very costly, especially in digitized and global world. So one video on social media can change the street tomorrow. That's what happened in Nepal as well in recent period. So autocrats have adapted, and they maintain power today by managing how people perceive reality, how people see the world. And they carefully stage election, they manipulate statistics and flood the media with stories of their own success. Contemporary authoritarian leaders, I think they seek to appear competent, popular, and even legitimate, more legitimate than the democratically elected leaders. Recently, in recent paper 2019 article, Gruyev and Trisman called this new model informational authoritarianism. Unlike the brutal dictatorship in the last century that ruled through fear and violence, today's autocrats rely a lot on controlling information, which I think Professor Ben-Ghiat described as propaganda and silencing. What does this mean for academic freedom? I think in this informational autocracies, universities become basically battleground for what is true, what is science, for what is reality. Regimes that depend on shaping beliefs have a strong incentive to control and deny independent knowledge and thinking that we are doing. Scholars who question official history, reveal corruption, and analyze inequality and threaten the regime's legitimacy, they are all the biggest threat to the regime. So the control, but the control is often subtle. So we talked about defunding, so larger funding opportunity to safe topics, visa deniers for foreign journalists and researchers, and public attacks, instead of regime repression, public attacks on academic works, I think has been common in many authoritarian countries today. These are basically what I have observed in my previous workplace, which was in Hong Kong, as I briefly described. My first job as an assistant professor was in Hong Kong from 2014. So 2014 was the year of the umbrella movement. So that was much smaller scale movement by students to sort of persuade the Hong Kong government, but also Chinese government, to have a fair election for the chief executive of the city. And then it failed, and then 5 years later it became much bigger movement, and then also violent movement. And then in 2020, as a response to the failed 2019 movement, the Chinese government also introduced the national security law, which changed the not only academic freedom, but all any intellectual conversation and like journalism, all that in one day in Hong Kong. So after national security law, opposition lawmakers were disqualified, independent media outlets were shut down, and then civil society organizations either were closed on their own from the pressure, or disbanded by the government. So like recollecting what I experienced in the last years of my stay in Hong Kong, I felt most deeply in this process, especially after the introduction of the national security law, was not the censorship by the government, not the censorship by the university, but it was more of self-censorship. So topics once open for the classroom, Hong Kong University, especially social science classes, were very, very liberal, especially in the context of overall like Chinese culture and Chinese institution. It was very liberal, but so I believe at least my class discussions were very, very open and liberal discussion. We discussed about democratization, social movement, political autonomy, human rights very freely before the movement or before the national security law. It became very, very sensitive to do so. And it was clear that students themselves find open discussion about this topic, especially in groups, were very uncomfortable. So there were students who approached me after the class or in office hour in person and spoke about what they think, but they wouldn't do it in a safe mind in group. Individual curiosity were definitely there, but they had to lay low under collective silence. And this was very obvious in the discussion about propaganda and silencing again in Professor Ben-Ghiat's talk. Again, without any obvious censorship. And then even policy from the university was unclear about class discussion, yet we found ourselves self-censor out of discomfort or out of feeling unsafe. I admit I self-censor myself as well, not because of fear, but because of the concerns for students, concerns for colleagues, concerns for my co-authors who are from mainland China, also who have families in mainland China. And then the discussion about dissertation topic, thesis topic, constantly involved the safety of the topic. Let me share a subtle but hopeful story as well. Looking back, the university was not very active, I think, during this process. All major universities in Hong Kong are public universities, and so it's somewhat understandable why they were neither active in repressing nor active in protecting us. So the pressure was not necessarily from the university. I think the most pressure was from outside, somewhat similar what some of our colleagues experienced in recent period as well. The universities, in my recollection, try best to do bare minimum and stay safe, make everybody stay safe. This inaction gave individual faculty member, this is very, so it might sound ironic, but a feeling of being in ivory tower. So unlike usual negative connotation that ivory tower have, this ivory tower gave us a feeling of solidarity among the colleagues. We do what we used to teach research and we perform daily tests until being told not to do so from outside or from the university. We knew university would not do much, and then so a lot of us do what we did. We try to teach critical thinking, and we teach the same topic we used to think until someone grab us and tell us not to do so. So at least until I left Hong Kong, we were never told not to study something by the university. I was lucky not to be caught by the outside observers as well. This ivory tower was not a fortress that could promise anything like legal protection, but it was instead the like-minded colleagues holding the line together. Do not give in to what is happening outside. Do your research, do pursue what is right and true, as we all should be. Just be professional. So still most of critical work about Hong Kong government, Hong Kong politics, Chinese politics is being produced in Hong Kong academia, and I'm very proud of it. Although there are other high-level changes that has happened to the city which make the city very different from what it used to be. I sincerely believe anything like this would happen in the United States. However, in any remotely similar case, I think our action, everyday action, will matter a lot, especially for the students, because we are in university. We are relatively better protected than the activists and fighters, and we can hold up the line together in this ivory tower. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hong. The last presenter, of course, is my colleague Ron Sooney.
So let me thank everybody, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr. Ben-Ghiat, for a wonderful talk, and for your optimism. The book that she wrote, Strongmen, ends with the collapse of the strongmen. And I'm basically a naive optimist. I believe that pessimism and cynicism leads to the right, and optimism and hope is what we as academics and as pedagogues should be ultimately delivering to our students. I want to start by saying that, in my opinion, and I'm a Soviet historian, I study the Soviet Union and Russia today, and suppressing speech and intellectual freedom is not only difficult, it's actually impossible. It can be restricted. It can be punished, and it can be driven underground. But speech and its cousin, intellectual freedom, is incredibly resilient. And it finds ways, often sneaky ways, to continue, to reappear in ways that may be disguised, Aesopian language perhaps, in dissent of various kinds, and even in silence. So when I study the Soviet Union, I think about the people, and Russia today, who are still struggling against what was done in that period. It wasn't so easy under Stalin, but later it became possible with the dissent movement and with other kinds of things, even in academia, which was collaborating with the state in some ways. And I think also of heroes of intellectual freedom. Think of the great Italian Marxist, communist, Antonio Gramsci, who in his prison, in fact, continued to write things that now have become resonant, sadly not only on the left, but also on the right. They're learning the lessons of Gramsci, and how he managed to make Mussolini's attempt to muzzle his mind a great failure. Now, it is true, as the lecturer told us today, and as all of us in this room, I'm sure, are observing, that there is an authoritarianism creeping through the United States and a kind of state project being constructed in our very midst. And indeed, it has a certain kind of a particular way of trying to achieve this. And that is the right and the radical right in the United States wants to take over, conquer, create, in Gramscian senses, a cultural hegemony in civil society. It already has the state. The Republican Party is this monolithic party that apologizes and defends Trump. The Supreme Court has been also falling under Trump's authority to some extent. The branches of government obviously are not acting in a balanced way that the founders thought. But imagine if they actually could control civil society, the institutions and associations outside of the state. And that would include the media and academia. And so that is part of the agenda. And it's precisely what Gramsci was talking about, how the left also had to create a counter-hegemony to prevent that part of our political establishment from conquering and taking over. Well, are there signs of this? We know the signs, and the lecture talked about them very well in a series of authoritarian efforts. Think of what happened yesterday when there was a pushback against many of these attempts. There were elections, after all. This is still a democracy. Now, don't think democracy is a complete guard against authoritarianism or against violence or against even genocide. Israel is still constituted as a democracy, and it committed genocide. And I applaud Derek for reminding us of this. But yesterday, society struck back. Some days ago, a dissident from Putin's Russia, Vladimir Kara-Murza, spoke and won our Wallenberg Medal. And his message to the students, which was so resonant in our own moment, is to the students and to whoever else was listening, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, because fear already plays into their hands, right? The radical right, which wants to undermine civil society and create what Professor Ben-Ghiat called moral collapse, which is so essential to authoritarianism, in fact, these are the things precisely that fear will lead us to. Now, it's not easy to be brave. Kara-Murza was an incredible example. He went to prison. He was poisoned twice. A very, very brave man. What we also have to avoid in a democratic society is complicity. By our silence and looking for our own advantages to somehow give in to what might be most easy to make a career, right? As someone who was turned down for tenure the first time at Oberlin College because I was a Marxist and so forth, precisely because of such things, we have to, again, be fearless, and we have to push against those things. By the way, within a week, they gave in, and I got the tenure, so, right. I never got a merit increase again, but I did survive. And then I came to the University of Michigan. Now, we're going to watch as this authoritarian tendency occurs, and it's going to become, it seems to me, increasingly violent. Now, violence is central not only to authoritarianism, but to fascism. So that's something we have to watch out about, and we have to protect those institutions like this university, which are so central to protecting intellectual freedom and speech. In her talk, Professor Ben-Ghiat talked about the similarities, the stylistic and intellectual and institutional similarities between authoritarians and the movement toward authoritarianism. But let's also emphasize, and this is something historians do rather well, the distinctions between these different things. If you have a democracy which is already being threatened, you have institutions and abilities and capacities which you may not have in Putin's Russia. But you do have it in Israel, you do have it in Orban's Russia, you do have it in Erdogan's Turkey. There's still possibilities, actually elections in Turkey and so forth. So let me just finish with talking a bit about Putin's Russia. Now, in Russia, you would think you ought to be pessimistic. because the authoritarianism is so already established. The attack on civil society has been very effective. But I can tell you from someone who studies it, who talks regularly to people in Russia, online, I can't go there anymore, but online, it doesn't work. Yes, there is large support of the war, but there is also, often quite quiet, resistance to the war. There was a huge immigration of people opposed to the war. And there are people who turn away, and even, as Karamurza mentioned, who fight through music, through organization, against what's happening. So there are, of course, reasons, if you want to be pessimistic, but there are, as our lecturer today said, incredible reasons in the various distinctive and different ways that this authoritarian is creeping forward in different places to be optimistic. And I would say, as she said, don't ever underestimate the American people, but this will sound really strange to you. Don't ever underestimate the Russian people. Now, our cliche about Russia is these are people who love slavery. They just never had it right. They always just lived under serfdom and communism, and now they've given in to Putin. No, actually, that's not true. Think of the number of times, if you know any Russian history, that ordinary people have gone out in the streets in 1905, in 1917, to make revolutionary change. Again, in the Putin period as well, to go out and demonstrate the Navalny demonstrations, etc., against these things. Think about this, and my colleagues here also mentioned this. The protests all over the world. I not only mean in the 1960s, which I'm proud to have been a member of, but the Arab Spring, or what went on in Bangladesh. And you mentioned, Jean, the thing in Nepal, where the students went out. Our own encampments, which were repressed, but in fact are witness to what is possible. So I say, and I want to end with this, we've got to think positively. We've got to be optimistic, even when it feels very difficult, not to despair. And indeed, ultimately, we will win.
Okay, thank you to all three respondents for the economy with which you've expressed yourselves. This leaves us now with just over 15 minutes for a conversation. You're welcome to formulate your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please would you line yourselves up there. I see that Layla is already next to the microphone to ask a question. And so follow on behind Layla. If you've got a question online, please raise your hand and formulate it and in text, is that right? And we'll read it out as a text. Craig Smith will read it out for us. Before we take questions from the crowd, let me simply ask Dr. Ben-Ghiat and other members of our group, if you feel you want to speak to this, to respond to a question I had in listening to the lecture, and that is it in fact true that autocracies are supported by hollowed out people in the way that Dr. Ben-Ghiat described it, people who are in a state of moral collapse, people who are quiescent, or is it rather that autocracies are very often supported by people who are inspired by the demand that the state, the sort of opportunity that the state might be harnessed for the purposes of national or collective liberation? That is, my own work on Idi Amin's Uganda, and perhaps also Ron's work on Stalin's Russia, suggests that it's actually people who see themselves as patriots liberating their people from outside oppressors, who are the most urgent supporters of autocratic regimes because they find in the state a means of achieving a kind of liberation that they feel to be historically necessary. So again, I doubt Dr. Ben-Ghiat's thesis that supporters of autocracies must be seen as kind of moral zombies. Is that in fact true?
So I was not, I agree with you, and this sense of authoritarians have been extraordinarily good, whether it's the anti-colonial era, whatever the era, at mobilizing people in terms of from grievances, from a sense that they were missing out and they can now create something better. And Trump was very brilliant talking about the forgotten and all of this. I wasn't trying to imply that the people who become hollowed out are the fervent supporters. I was talking about something that I feel is missed a bit, that when we keep talking about hollowing out institutions, we don't look at the effects on people. And these are the people who are just trying to exist often. And they and I wanted to highlight how ultimately these regimes are a mix of fanaticism and zealotry, but also nihilism, where where truth is destroyed. And Solzhenitsyn talked about how the lies depend on the violence, and there's the synergy between the lies and the violence, and the obliteration of everything in the service of power, and that's where we get the behaviors of also that some of the commentators mentioned, and how you survive autocracy through this kind of stultifying sense that you can't be authentic. And Hannah Arendt addressed this too. So you have coded language, you have necessary self-censorships, you have a constant concealment. Like I remember a comment by someone who lived under Putin, who said, "I have 4 faces. I have the face for the public. I have the, and I'm only myself with my wife in certain circumstances in certain places." So just to clarify, I didn't think that it's the people who are hollowed out and who are the base of support.
Thanks. Thank you for that. I don't know, perhaps we ought to have questions from the crowd and leave you all to respond as you see. So, Dr. Leila Kowar.
Thank you. I'll be quick because I see there are many others. I always come to these talks because they were founded by the University of Michigan Ann Arbor AAUP chapter, and I currently serve as an officer. If anyone is not in our AAUP chapter, please look us up. You can join. This week, there was a really important report released by the American Association of University Professors and the Middle East Studies Association about the weaponization of civil rights law, and specifically Title VI complaints. And the details are really eye-opening and staggering. And it just resonated with the talk that you gave, and also with some of Ron's comments and the other commentators about self-censorship and silencing. So the report in its overview summary says, anti-Semitism investigations are producing a new system of government surveillance and monitoring of campus speech. The advocacy organizations, including those without any campus presence, have driven this surge in anti-Semitism investigations in at least 78% of the complaints over the past 2 years, and at least 24% of them, the group bringing it, an external group, has no connection to the campus. And then in the reporting about this report, one of these groups, Stand With Us, is quoted as saying that they work very closely with the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs in bringing these complaints. So I guess I'm asking a question about civil society, about multiple involvements, and I'm not sure that the framework of authoritarianism or autocracy fully encompasses it, but what's happening is certainly about silencing, about conformity, about self-censorship, and I'd appreciate hearing your thoughts.
Who would like to take that? Dr. Ben-Ghiat, perhaps.
I think definitely there's been that is the bludgeon issue that is being used by the Trump administration and its foreign and domestic supporters, and it unites because we know that evangelicals are a very important plank when we think about. I agree that maybe this goes more broadly than just authoritarianism, right? As you said, but it's important that every ruler who wants to be authoritarian has these kind of support, networks and pillars of society. And Christian evangelicals, who are part of this, policing of anti-Semitism, pro-Israel, are very important. So they've chosen an issue which very strategically, and that is because that, along with suppressing quote wokeness, DEI, which is their war on blackness, which falls off. I'm about to write an essay about the war on blackness because we're not hearing about it enough right now. But I think it's been chosen very strategically, and it's being used. I guess I will read this report in a classic way with foreign involvement, and I think that's an area of research because we know that the Trump administration has opened the doors to malign foreign influence, increasing by Russia, by China, and we need to investigate this pathway too.
This is maybe not exactly an answer to your question, but it just woke up something in my mind, how these authoritarian regimes, and you see this right now, are very cleverly about making enemies, creating enemies that really don't exist, right? It's not that there isn't anti-Semitism. There's always anti-Semitism, and there's always Islamophobia, and there's other kinds of phobias and antis. But they use that as a weapon to then create enemies like academics in general. Though I would imagine, in my understanding and my experience, I taught for 55 years, the academy was one of the places where people were least anti-Semitic, where the fight against anti-Semitism was actually part of even the curriculum, right? And Trump and others. So Trump called Mamdani a communist. Really? Communists were not democratic socialists. They were authoritarian socialists. I'm sorry to say that. And universities, incubators of Marxism? Really? Would that that were true, but it's not. I would have felt more at home, but it's not true, right? It's heavily liberal, right? But there's one of the things about liberalism is there's debate between left, right, and so forth and so on. So, we have to struggle against these kinds of falsities and creation of enemies. In Russia, it was vrag narodi, enemies of the people. That phrase is actually used by the right, and Trump used it to characterize the media.
Okay, let's go to the next question.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I have a question about what is to be done about the fact that university administrations themselves are pushing things that facilitate moral collapse, that facilitate silences. So the two examples that are at the forefront of my mind is the push for students to use artificial intelligence to, quote unquote, expand their thinking, and the use of police on campus to violently suppress student protesters. So what do we do when administrations are promoting the very things that we are talking about here in this discussion?
Thank you for that. Who would like to tackle that question? I nominate Dr. Ben-Ghiat.
I was thinking Professor Hong would be qualified more than me, but and I will pick up from her very wise remarks of at the end of her comments that our everyday actions will matter to our students and also within our community, our ivory tower, and that we're showing solidarity to each other. I think that it's very important. I mean, the campus campuses are part of civil society, and it's very important to show solidarity to colleagues who are targeted, and just model the values, model democratic values as things become more repressive. And AI, I'm not an expert on, so I can't comment on that. But the policing part, and I think also when often we're quick to denounce people, but I think it's really important to send a little message always to people who are standing up. Not only the direct people standing up, but people who support people who are standing up, and create a chain of goodwill, and because that's showing solidarity as well. Because it's not easy to speak out, and even like, members of Congress, you think that people wouldn't care about hearing from you. It's important to stand up and support those behaviors, whether it's on campus or externally.
Dr. Hong?
So I try not to self-censor myself here. Even at the peak of protests in Hong Kong, I don't recall police being on campus. So I think maybe they were busy repressing protesters on street, but I don't remember. And then I remember that was one of the debate whether police should be allowed in the campus to filter the students or to filter the activists on campus, but at least where I worked, it was not allowed. That, I think, tells something by itself. Yeah.
Okay, let's have a third question. We've got a few minutes left.
Hi. So hopefully this will be a fairly short question, but just a little bit of background. I'm I'm a postdoc in a STEM department. I essentially live under a rock, and my background, even though I absolutely agree with everything you said, I'm not super familiar with perhaps some of the foundations here. So sorry if this is a naive question. But what is the mechanism by which silent protest will sort of act against the moral collapse if we're sort of preaching to the choir? And I'm thinking about this in terms of like a No Kings March in a place that's already, say, very liberal. I'm not questioning whether it is important or works, but I just don't know how. And
Thank you for that question. I think we ought to have the other two questioners ask their questions, and then we'll address all three together here. Please.
Hi, I'm Simone Davis, and among other things, I'm Chandler Davis's daughter. And I wanted to share one very quick anecdote really fast and then ask a question. And the anecdote is triggered by Ron's remarks. One of the very last political gestures my father made in his life from a hospital bed was to join an international conference in support of an imprisoned Russian young mathematician dissident. And so I really appreciated your bringing to light the fact that not all Russians are the same as each other, and the fact of that powerful, powerful presence of a very brave dissidents there. So thank you for that. And my question is something I'm struggling with about the relationship between violence, and also the kind of intellectual violence that results in self-censorship, et cetera. So we've got ice on the streets and stuff. I worked for years with people colleagues in prison and students in prison, and I think about how the fact of them being sequestered and that the violence that was happening there being apart from the rest of society seemed so important, but right now it seems like realms, the lips between realms are dissolving, and I'm struggling to understand how these different kinds of violence intersect.
Thank you. My question's a follow-up to his. We can see the value of mass protests like No Kings where we have millions, but what about more local protests? The last No Kings protest, we got 5,000 people in Ann Arbor before a football game. 2 weeks later, we did a follow-up, got 200. We're going to do another one before the Ohio State game. But my other question is, how do we link up, and this is for everybody here, how do we link up to the university and to the young people? Because now it's mostly us seniors. But how do we get the generations working together on this?
Okay, so 2 questions about protest and its effect and its organization, and then one, a more analytical question about how different kinds of violence intersect. Who would like to start addressing those?
Lennon said, seize every podium, so No King's March. Let's start there. I think it's very important, whether 200 people or 7 million, as there were in the last one, that there be presence, that people appear, that people know that there are others like them, that there's something strengthening in solidarity. So that seems to me extraordinarily important, that you're not alone, that there are others out there like you. And I don't think that always marching and so forth is the only way you can do this. I remember in the 60s, students asking, I want to be radical. What should I do that's radical? What's being radical? And what I came up with, what I thought of is, being radical means being honest, acting with integrity. Do you know how difficult that is in a society that rewards complicity, compromising, giving in, right? Adjusting to the powers that be. I mean, look at the Republican Party. Look at how Trump has manipulated and dominated part of civil society. So it seems to me that each of us individually, not to give up on the collective aspects, each of us individually acting with integrity and being honest, doing our work and seeing where it takes us. Because what is the university about? We're in a university. The university is about finding truths, right? We know, well, the doubt about truth, but finding different truths and seeing where that goes. And it seems to me that's hard. And a lot works against you, but you keep doing that, swimming upstream. Being what you called critical thinking. I mean, for me, Marxism is a critical way of thinking, right? And good liberalism is a critical way of thinking. So that's what I would say is part of our strength.
Brief additional responses, if any of you would like to speak.
Thank you very much for these questions. I wanted to answer a couple of them. I wanted to say, for me, I teach international human rights law, and I actually think in this day and age, what is more important than what I'm saying in the classroom is what the university is modeling, and all of us are modeling. It's very difficult to be trying to teach and instill human rights values if students are going to be pepper sprayed at close range. And so the practice is absolutely as important as what we are attempting to teach in the classroom. I also wanted to say, in response to the question with regard to No Kings, I do think we have to do everything we can to get out of our echo chambers and build the broadest possible coalition that supports basic democratic values, bringing together the center-right, the center-left. I think some of the center-right voices right now, like the Lincoln Project, are absolutely critically important. And so I encourage us all to reach out to those with perhaps very different views, but who might have some similar core values to come together to defend intellectual freedom.
Okay, Dr. Ben-Ghiat, you get the last comment here.
So these are great questions. I think one of my maxims, besides never underestimate the American people, is use all the tools and spaces at your disposal for protest, for peaceful protest. And not everybody wants to be in the streets. For example, a lot of young people in Myanmar, there was incredible, at the beginning, there was incredible work of building apps to have consumer boycotts against the junta that told people in real time which businesses were collaborating with the junta. So boycotts are very popular with all ages. I'm a big fan of registering people to vote. We should never, ever give up on the vote. I have people who, write to me or tell me, oh, you can't vote your way out of fascism. But that's just fatalistic and cynical in my book. And there are just many things that you can do that you don't have to be going into the streets. Although I agree with what Professor Sooni said, it's very important to be present and showing others, no matter what the numbers are, that someone cares and is out there. About the violence, real quick, in periods like this, and this is why I wanted to call attention to the breaking of taboos, it's true that there's physical violence that's first directed at certain categories of people and then expands, and there's the threat of violence. And the threat of violence becomes more real the more we see violence and repressive actions in spaces that were not, where they weren't happening as with such frequency before. And regimes rely, especially today, the informational autocracies that were mentioned, they rely on that threat working. So they don't, because violence, as Professor Hong says, is costly. It's costly reputationally. It's costly, like, in a monetary way. And so the threat of violence bleeds into the actual violence. You never, in a well-run authoritarian state, you never know if you're going to be next. And so then you go into the self-censorship. But I'm glad I heard so much optimism here, because sometimes people think I'm just some kind of weirdo idealist. But I truly believe from my study of autocracy that they're always more of us than them. And that is why autocrats are always running scared, always building their bunkers and ballrooms, and musing and brooding over what might happen to them because of the power of the people. So I'll finish with that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Ben-Ghiat. We have one more bit of business to do here before we say thank you formally to the panel and to Dr. Ben-Ghiat, and that is to launch the book in the spirit of H. Chandler Davis. To do that work, let me invite to the podium Gary Krentz, who should now come to the podium. He is a person of all parts. He retired in 2023 after a long career here at U of M. He was at various times advisor to the Vice President for Research, Director of the Bicentennial in 2017, and a special counsel to President Mary Sue Coleman, in which role he played an important part in the foundation of the African Studies Center, which is what brought me here to the U of M in 2009. And for our purposes in faculty government, he's been a great friend and a member of the Davis, Markert, and Nickerson Academic Freedom Lecture Committee, and he's now one of the editors of this book, about which he will shortly say more.
Thank you very much, Derek, and thank you, of course, to our speaker and our panelists for such an excellent and really important discussion. I'm honored to be here representing my co-editors, Michael Atzman, John Cheney-Lippold, and Melanie Tennelian. And we would all like to thank SACUA and the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture Committee for giving us this apt opportunity to launch in the spirit of Chandler Davis activism and the struggle for academic freedom. In publishing this volume of essays, and I'm going to say a little bit more about the book in just a minute, it's our fervent hope that truly the spirit of Chandler Davis, as reflected by the contributors, will provide inspiration, both intellectual and emotional, to meet in our own difficult time the threats that our speaker and panel have pointedly addressed. Chandler Davis knew better than most how to, in his own words, keep resistance alive, and we hope we learn from his example. Any of us who attended these lectures more than just a few years ago will remember Chandler's generous participation each year, starting with the first, always asking a question, sometimes the first. And Simone, thank you for giving us a little echo of that today. And we continue to miss him at these events. Now, I did not know Chandler as well as some people in this room. My interactions with him were mostly in connection with this lecture series. I can say, though, that my reaction on meeting him for the first time was immediate and was fully confirmed subsequently. He exuded tremendous dignity, concern, thoughtfulness, and incisiveness. Although I imagine that he was always the smartest person in the room, he never talked down to anyone, and he responded to all inquiries and comments with respect and genuine interest, whether he agreed or not. He was a model of intellectual engagement. He had broad interests and abilities. He was, of course, a highly accomplished mathematician, despite how disruptive his persecution was to that work. He made significant contributions to numerical analysis, geometry, algebraic logic. He uncovered the properties of the fractal known as the dragon curve and was known for the Davis-Gahan theorem, the Davis-Gahan-Weinberger dilation theorem, and I have no idea what any of that means, right? But clearly the mathematicians respected him tremendously. He was also an excellent writer on a wide range of topics, producing critical essays, and I think this is not widely known, but also poetry and fiction, including science fiction. And I do know some things about that, and I would highly commend to you his collection of non-mathematical work called It Walks in Beauty. Of course, the primary reason behind our new volume, and the primary reason we celebrate him today, was his lifelong pursuit of justice and defense of academic and intellectual freedom. His activism extended to agitating for peace, justice for the oppressed and underprivileged, gender equity, Palestinian rights, environmental protection, and more. Now, we heard earlier about actions here at U of M that led to his suspension and dismissal, along with his colleagues Mark Nickerson and Clement Markert, as well as graduate students Myron Sharp and Ed Schaefer. I want just briefly to emphasize an aspect that was unique to Chandler and I think illustrative of him. When HUAC was working to coerce people to name names, the legally established means to refuse and to avoid a contempt citation was to invoke the Fifth Amendment, sometimes but not always in conjunction with the First Amendment protections of free speech. This approach was taken by most people called before the committee, including those others I just mentioned. Chandler chose to invoke the First Amendment only, a largely untested strategy, inviting almost certainly a contempt citation. He did so seeking to force the constitutional question of the legitimacy of HUAC's actions, hopefully going to the Supreme Court. Also, to direct public attention past the sort of fog of innuendo that could arise from claiming the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, away from that toward the constitutional crisis at the heart of the Red Scare. Sadly, his effort failed, and he spent several months in prison as a result. But we might say this response of a direct resistance to an attack on rights, this going on the offensive, as it were, precisely embodied the spirit of Chandler Davis. And today, when too many cave, with much less provocation, to Trump's and others' assaults, they embody exactly the opposite, and they contribute to the moral collapse that has been discussed today. So on to the volume. The idea for this book coalesced not long after Chandler passed, which is just over 3 years ago now. The contributors include past Davis Markert Nickerson lecturers, including Michael Berube, Marjorie Hines, Dima Khalidi, Jean Nickel, Hank Reichman, Joan Scott, and Catherine Stimson. Natalie Zeman Davis is represented by an essay reprint. Other contributors include scholars, including U of M colleagues who have written on activism and academic freedom, Juan Cole, Stefan Hans, Alan Wald, and Silke Marie Weineck, and a photo essay on UM campus activism with which Rebecca Modrek was very helpful. We are fortunate to include a reprint of the open letter to the Ann Arbor community that Chandler himself wrote several years ago and that some of you might recall. We are gratified by the contributors' enthusiastic responses. The topics range over academic and intellectual freedom in various settings and situations, campus activism, including some of its history at U of M, questions of academic freedom in connection to pro-Palestinian activism, and the values that inform and support all of the above. In many, indeed most cases, the essays tie Chandler's work and his historical moment here at U of M to the present, and although all were written before the 2024 election, they continue to speak to our current situation and are more timely than ever. I hope you will think so too, and think that they are a fitting tribute to Chandler Davis. As you have likely seen in the program, we will have an event at Literati bookstore 1 week from today at 6:30, featuring a conversation with Ellen Schrecker, former DMN lecturer and one of the premier historians of academic freedom. And the book is available just outside the room here, and will be on the Michigan Publishing website under the Disobedience Press imprint. Proceeds will help support the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture. We greatly appreciate the support that SACUA and the Faculty Senate Office have provided. Rebecca Modrek's and Nick Tobir's editorial work at Disobedience Press has been invaluable. I especially want to acknowledge Natalie Zeman Davis, who was very supportive until her death in 2023. Chandler's and Natalie's children, Aaron Davis, Hannah Tayeb, and Simone Davis, have themselves been encouraging and very helpful. And of course, we're happy to have two of them here, Simone and Aaron. Would you both please rise for a minute? I think we have just a little something to present.
Right. So it falls to me in conclusion to, first of all, thank Gary Krentz for that lovely introduction to this book and to encourage you to buy a copy of the book outside the door. Thank you also to the provost, who's been here for the whole session and willingly participates in this event every year. We appreciate that very much. Thank you also to our lecturer, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, and the panel, including Ron Suni, Dr. Banoun, and Dr. Hong, who have been so insightful in their comments. Thank you also to the Davis, Markert, and Nickerson Lecture Planning Committee, Craig and Nick in particular, and other members of the committee who've done really good work. Thank you to the anonymous donor whose gift has made this endowed lecture series possible. And thank you to the Democracy and Civil Engagement Program for providing a grant in support of this year's DMN programming. That falls to me to basically say thank you again to all of you for coming and to wish you all a good night.